why socialism? What's the logic behind it? I'm more of a capitalist like sock dimmy type. So, why is socialism or I don't know if communism is your end goal, but why is that sort of a goal of yours?
So you call yourself a social democrat, right?
I do.
All right. So when it comes to socialism, one thing that I value a lot is just the idea of democracy. And I'm not a social democrat because I think social democrat is in some ways is kind of like a means testing version of socialism, which nationalizes certain aspects like healthcare or education, but then it kind of falls short on others that I find very pivotal to what I'd want in an economic system. Um, Now, there's many different ways you can go about like explaining why you support a given system or not when it comes to
Sure.
morally or just the actual efficiency of it. Um, the moral argument that I could make is that I think maximizing democracy to, um, I think maximizing democracy is just generally a good thing. Maybe there's some exceptions, um, like absolute direct democracy. There are some drawbacks, but I think for the most part, I think maximizing democracy is a good thing. I think democracy in the workplace makes sense since again, at least we allow people to vote in representatives. Why do we allow people to vote in representatives or government? It's because what the government does has an effect on the daily lives of people, even if some of it's indirect. I think the workplace has more immediate effects on your average worker than the government does in the short term. So I think it would make sense if workplaces were also democratized. That's the moral argument. Um, Now, the actual argument I would make when it comes to like the effectiveness and efficiency of a give the given system is one. I think worker managed firms is probably the best way to go about things when it comes to maximizing good utility in the world, like worker satisfaction, happiness, best quality of life. And it also seems that worker owned firms, when it comes to productivity, there really isn't much of a negative or positive effect. Um, it seems to stay about the same when it comes to conventional firms. Also, it seems like they're more resilient and other things like that. Now, um, so I guess that's the more efficiency aspect of my argument. Obviously, there's more to it, but I do think social democracy stops short of a lot of things that I would want in I guess, more ideal society that I think is achievable. Um, and that's one of them, is I think it just stops short when it comes to what is best for the workers and allowing them to have true control of their lives to the best extent that we can allow them to. I also in the belief that social democracy does require exploitation, but we can get into that later on. Can you clarify whether or not you're can you clarify whether or not you're a capitalist because you think capitalism, like you're an actual like you just legitimately just like capitalism, or is it like more like a pragmatic thing where we don't think capitalism can just be abolished?
Well, I think overall I would disagree with a lot of those assumptions in there, but I would say that for me, I think that there's probably a stronger moral case and pragmatic case for capitalism. For me personally, I would say that morally, the idea of capitalism is, you know, uh, to me, it's a bit more, I guess, resonant to me than a socialist moral argument. But I don't necessarily care as much about the moral argument of economic systems versus their
Yeah.
actual outcomes. It's really the outcomes that I care about the most.
So what do you want to talk about first, like specifically?
Yeah, sure. So I think we can talk about the moral argument a little bit. I would say that um, to me, I do understand the moral argument of socialism. The problem is I feel like a capitalist framework alternative can capture all of the sort of moral gains and mitigate you could say the moral losses of capitalism. So I mean, to me, what's the preference between worker board membership and unionization in a capitalist framework versus a collective ownership model like a cooperative model like you described? What's the bright line, the moral difference between those two things?
Well, yeah, I obviously do agree that the actual economic argument is more important than I thought I should bring up. When it comes to the moral argument, I think that we wouldn't. There are certain things when it comes to like actual representation um, in the workplace. Having them have the means of protection, I think, is the best way to go about things. I view just saying, "Hey, you get some representation, you get some representation on like these boards or whatever." That seems like a half measure, kind of to the point where, like, imagine if we could only vote for the presidency, but we couldn't vote for the Senate or House. Um, I think that in that context, it would not seem good to your average person. I feel like giving your average only just a little bit of the control in their workplace when most of the work is done by the average worker, and most of the labor is actually done by the worker, it doesn't fit right with me. But the actual uh, the actual other argument I'd make for it is that one, I think democracy in the end makes people happy. It does seem that the well-being of workers, even like health-wise, because obviously mental health-wise and social trust-wise, that can affect your physical health in the long term, does seem to be better for the average worker. Um, and but we can get into that, more. And I don't want to have like a a little like debate for a study thing or name of
Yeah.
studies or whatever. That's not
Well,
very interested in doing that. But
I
yeah.
mean, I would just say that the so I think shifting a little bit here, I would say that to me morally, I think capital has a reasonable seat at the table. That's why worker board membership makes a
Mm.
lot of sense to me. You can split it up evenly, capital and labor, and you can have a what do you call it collectively determined or a consensus determined between the two management team that in theory represents both of their interests and that seems to be what is bore out in a lot of companies that have worker board membership either in a minority case or a parity case where there's half and half. There actually seems to be more evidence that uh, 33% or 30% membership is actually more effective than 50%, which seems very unintuitive, but at least that's what the evidence says. And so to me, that's kind of where I could stop in on the moral argument. On the outcome argument, to me, the issue is that all of the gains of cooperative ownership, the more solidarity between management and workers, more productive workers, the happiness that you describe, things like that. Um, these are all actually gains of worker board membership. That these are empirical findings that when you have a firm with the stability of employment, the resistance to price shocks, these are all things that happen when a company is managed by at least a board of workers and capital owners, or board members who are just elected by capital owners, and that means to me you would prefer the worker board membership over a cooperative from an outcome basis because at least the worker board membership doesn't have the same problems with investment or scaling or things like that. It seems like we can capture the gains of cooperatives without actually experiencing any of the structural issues with a cooperatively managed economy.
Well, yeah, but when it comes to workers owning the means of production versus just workers on boards obviously actually fits within our current capitalist system. While if you had a, let's say, almost full
Right.
economy, full of co-ops, we it's harder to see the potential results from co-ops right now, because being surrounded by conventional firms. When it comes to like the failures on certain aspects of co-ops, it seems to be mostly rooted in external factors like shifting markets, regulatory requirements. It doesn't seem really it's internal factors. I think there's like a study in Alberta, Canada. It covered like 100, 200 so cooperatives incorporated with a rather short time span, and they found that the ones that did fail, internal factors were cited rather rarely. One of them did include a lack of united vision and dishonesty and stuff like that, but it wasn't very common. Certain problems that worker co-ops do have is like when it comes to, like startup capital, someone to provide like mentorship, things like that. but a lot of it seems to be more external factors and not really the system being developed to like fit co-ops in to be the predominant system. So I feel so obviously it's hard to like um in a vacuum like prove this or whatever either way. But I do think that a lot of what we see when it comes to the results of co-ops isn't at like the potential where it could be if the whole system was driven by worker-owned firms. But I mean,
Well,
obviously, it's really hard to determine that.
sure. I would disagree though. At least for me, the two problems principally in with cooperative organization as a mandate for the economy. If we were going to
Hmm.
transition the economy to be, of all the businesses, say 90% of them are cooperatives because there's probably some room for like self-employed people or something like that. Um,
Yeah.
if we were to transition, the problem with that isn't, you know, I guess anything like you've mentioned. Um, the issues that you describe are inherent to the mode of production, or the means of production of cooperative organization, right? The idea that you have less investment capital, well, that's not because of any structure. That's because of your own structure, right? The reason you have less investment capital is because the capital of your business is only from the workers, right? Now, you could argue that, oh, well, banks could lend out money and fund that startup capital, but that's risky. You're heavily leveraging banks. If it's a state investment bank, you face the economic calculation problem. Like, how do you decide which business gets the bank? In the case where most every worker is an owner, you have the problem where like is every single worker going to have like a really really good credit rating, and is every person with a bad credit rating now unable to get both a mortgage, a loan, and a job, because now if they have to be an owner they have to have a good credit rating. Like, these things are all structural problems to cooperatives, not necessarily an external factor. In regard to the unemployment issue, I mean, I made a video about this, which is just the idea that if everybody has to be an owner of a business, then it creates a higher cost of hiring, right? If you give every employee equity in the business when they're hired, you're kind of forcing everyone who currently owns the business to dilute their equity, right? So I use the example of like, if a if a business is worth $100,000, which is obviously a very small business, right? But just use the
Yeah.
example, $100,000. That means that every equity shareholder in that business, 1/10 of 100 grand, $10,000 is the equity value that everyone holds. Well, if you hire an 11th worker because you need the person or otherwise, you're diluting the equity to 1/11th, right? So that 100 grand is now 1/11th, right? And so now it's worth, instead of 10 grand, it's worth, you know, I don't know, 9,500 or something like that. Call it that. Well, you might make the argument that the labor is producing value for the business, and I don't disagree, right? People will still get hired in a cooperative economy. It's just a lot less people will, because instead of your cost of hiring being, virtually zero, especially on an owner side, well, now it could potentially be thousands and thousands of dollars for every employee that you hire right off the bat. It just increases the barriers, so the structural unemployment of the economy will go uh, much higher, I would imagine. So those are the two issues that are fundamental to the structure of cooperatives, not necessarily any exogenous factor like you described. All the studies I've read, I agree, have proven that cooperatives, on a, you could say a micro level, but on a as a microcosm of the economy, are quite stable. I just worry about actually making them a primary form of organization. I think that would cause a lot of structural issues.
Yeah. But so you did mention like
Hmm.
when it comes to like the struggle like of getting loans or paying off like a mortgage or something. Well, some of the examples you named I don't think would really apply to a socialist system, considering I don't think they would exist under a social system because some
Well,
things you
yeah,
did
yeah.
name would
So
imply they
quick,
would be
quick,
private enterprise. But still, I get the
yeah,
point.
quickly though. I,
Um,
I think I think that's
yeah,
I think the point isn't necessarily the idea of getting a loan or mortgage in a socialist system. The idea is that if the solution to the disinvestment problem of cooperatives is, oh well, banks will give loans and we won't really rely on equity financing as much, that's not an unreasonable position to have. The problem with that, though, is that if you're relying on the state or private businesses to extend loans as a form of capital instead of equity, the issue is that because every employee is an owner of a company, the credit score and the credit worthiness of every single individual person becomes 1,000 times more valuable because not only now is your credit score determining your ability to get credit on a personal level, even if personal credit doesn't exist in a socialist economy, it's now determining your ability to even get a job because a co-op isn't going to want to hire someone who has a history of poor credit because that might hurt their ability to get capital, only increasing the structural and employment problem I referenced earlier.
Yeah. I don't agree with everything you've said, but
Sure.
there obviously are legitimate like criticisms of worker-owned co-ops and legitimate problems. Though I don't like to be caught up in every specific single one, considering there are also problems you can make of conventional firms that in practice that would make sense in theory, but once done in practice, it doesn't really seem to be that much of a problem.
Like what?
Um, there are like I guess like for example, when it comes to like for example like worse working conditions, like the whole
Mhm.
like why don't you just leave your business kind of thing. It doesn't like if there's like bad working conditions or not high enough wages, it doesn't really work out all like that all the time because of obviously
Right.
external factors such as people not really having jobs in other areas, such things like that. Or there are things that are like work like this in theory, but in practice they don't actually really turn out that way. But you also mentioned how again why not just have workers on boards or like kind of a more of a mixture of the system, not have workers own the means of production.
Sure.
Now, when studies go over worker managed firms and then conventional firms, obviously in the conventional firms, it does still include businesses with work boards of workers on them. Um, so I mean, it's still I
Well,
obviously as in
well,
yep.
sure, but I mean I mean not really though because that's kind of like saying, oh well, this I don't know, this study, this study concluded that I don't know, I'm trying to think of an example. This study concluded that people who have guns stored in their home are more likely to have an incident of gun death in their home, right? And that's a fairly well bore out empirical finding. That obviously, if you have a gun in your home, you're more likely to uh, have an accident related with that gun in your house, right? Well, I could then say that, oh well, black people are more likely to have an incident related to a gun accident in their home if they have a gun in their home. And I could cite that study. Well, black people are part of the people, right? That's not really a fair assertion because obviously the only way to directly make that statement would be a study comparing the organization of a worker board managed company and an organization of a cooperatively managed company, right? Just worker board membership isn't even that popular, in Europe. It's only I think I saw it's like 40% of companies that are eligible to have worker board membership actually have it, and it's a voluntary system. So I mean, it it's not quite a reasonable statement to say that there's one over the other, especially when there's studies that prove the opposite. That the stability and you know the the investment issues and these are kind of things that are positive with worker board managed companies versus cooperatives.
I don't know. I mean, that wasn't really the main point I was gonna make.
Okay,
But I was just saying that it wasn't obviously there isn't much. I mean, I guess you just probably there's probably like literature on it, but not like nearly as expansive when it comes to worker managed firms versus conventional firms. When it comes to specifically worker managed firms and
that's fair.
firms with worker boards. Um, but when it comes to worker managed firms versus conventional firms with when it comes to conventional firms, it does seem that in both definitely in times of recession and like in times of downturn, um, co-ops are more resilient, and also it does seem
Sure,
that and when it comes to times of economic boom, it's not nearly as one-sided, but there is still data that shows that. Uh, for example, how again, going back to the Alberta Canada study, um, it showed that about 3 year survival rates for co-ops incorporated in 2005 and 2006 was about 81.5% compared to
Mhm.
48% for conventional firms in the area. I do think that worker I would assume that workers on boards would probably increase that rate. I don't think it would nearly double it like worker managed firms would, considering it does the structure would be fundamentally different. So I don't think just adding workers on boards for representation would really make companies more resilient compared to a new structure, um, like a co-op. So, uh, yeah, we're gonna say something?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're kind of conflating two issues, like the idea of resilience and stability versus your startup survivability rate. Now, I have not seen any data on startup survivability rate for worker board membership, mostly probably because the worker board membership mandates that exist mostly in the European economies exist for bigger firms in the first place, right? And so there's probably, if you did that study, there would be a bias in the data anyway. The idea that, well, if you're already a bigger company, you're probably more likely to obviously have survived your first 5 years because you've probably already made it past your
Yeah.
first 5 years. So that'd be hard to study. Um, and in the cases where worker board membership is actually applied, it's usually voluntary. So it's voluntary on the part of the workers. So the workers have the option to put their own members on the boards. And interestingly, a significant portion of them choose not to, either because they're protected by trade unions or sectoral unions or things like that. That they often choose not to place workers on the boards of companies. Though in the cases that they do that, the actual stability gains of worker cooperatives are present in worker board managed companies. Their survivability rate, I guess I'm just not as concerned about. I mean, I think that's potentially an argument for um, some of the issues of unemployment that you might see in a cooperatively managed economy. Like, hey, well, yeah, there's a lot less businesses starting, but the ones that do start are very, very likely to continue and be able to hire and grow and things like that. But um, it's not necessarily bore out. That's why, to me, I think it's tough not to have a debate on the theory of cooperative organization because not a lot of them exist. I mean, naturally, the argument would be that if it is truly a very superior form of organization, why doesn't it exist in a broader scale now? That's an argument that I don't often make, but it's one that resonates at least somewhat.
Yeah, I mean, worker co-ops obviously aren't prevalent, but there are still enough of them to make statements when it comes to how effective they are when looking at like statistical analysis of worker
Yeah.
co-ops.
Well, sure. It's
Uh,
just hard to
yeah,
hard to
but
make the statement that they're better though in terms of economic outcome because in theory they were truly better, and there were no structural problems internal or innate to cooperatives. We would see a lot of them all over the place. Now they would just outcompete regular firms. That doesn't seem to be the case today.
well, yeah, I mean, would a worker co-op of a similar size to another business be able to like outcompete another firm or like accumulate capital as quickly? Uh, Probably not. I mean, obviously, in a vacuum, it's hard to, figure that out. But still, probably not. But I'm not really concerned all that much about it because when it comes to what I want, my main goals is to increase the standard of living for your average person as much as
Sure.
possible, to a point that we can within.
Right.
Um, and if worker co-ops, if it increases the well-being of your average person, um, the productivity really isn't affected all that much, and they seem to be more resilient. I'm willing to take that over a firm that would be able
Hmm.
to outcompete them when it comes to like accumulating capital or what's or whatever. That's just my view on it. If we have we could just have a completely different um, view for what we value, and I mean, I don't really see like each other like us like getting to each other on that if we have like a complete different mindset when it comes to that.
No, no,
Um,
no. I mean, I started out the conversation saying I cared mostly just about the outcome, which is to say I care about the
yeah,
sort of
yeah,
median
but I guess
person's material
we might be
condition.
using different metrics when it comes to what we describe as like the best outcome.
Okay. I mean, what do you, I mean, for me, I guess I would use, access to, income, right? And your purchasing power, ability to purchase things like water and electricity, food, amenities of life, your access to quality healthcare, transit, garbage pickup, things like that. I mean, I think I would use a fairly standard evaluation for a people's or a person's well-being. What do you think? Do you think there would be big differences between what I just said and maybe how you would view the quality of life of a person?
I think there would be some difference. Obviously, when it comes to like financially, obviously, would of course that goes into quality of life. Um, but I think like the overall happiness and well-being of person also plays a big part. So, like for example, in countries where working conditions are better, people tend to be happier for obvious reasons if the working conditions are better, and they
Right.
actually just tend to be more productive that way, usually
Of course.
significantly more so.
Right.
So I do think when it comes to productivity, you can actually increase productivity if the general population is happier and is more content with their work. And I think one way of doing that is making sure they have democratization of the workplace. Though getting into getting into this, some people in chat might cringe if we're talking about happiness or whatever.
Well,
There's
sure,
a lot of
yeah.
cynical people in chat.
Oh yeah, that's fair. I mean, I think my response to that would be that, the happiest nations on earth are the Nordic economies, and they have
Yeah,
not a predisposition, but they have a culture of unionization and collective bargaining and worker board membership. They all have worker board membership, at least as a policy. I think Iceland. I'm not sure if Iceland does, but they have the highest unionization rate. They have like a 90% unionization rate. It's also a country roughly the size of like, a small village or something. I mean, it's a very very
yeah.
tiny tiny country. And so maybe they're not as relevant to the broader discussion. Poor little Iceland, but you get what I'm saying overall. Is that the happiest countries tend to be the Nordic economies, and they're capitalist economies. And to me, I think that if you care about an individual's ability to voice their concern in the workplace, and have that concern be actionable, right, in the form of a democratic structure, um, I don't see any reason why you would necessarily prefer a collective ownership style economy where every business or most every business is a worker cooperative over worker board membership and unionization, right? Where you can collectively bargain and you can decrease, the monopsony power of businesses, that you can have actual actionable leverage as part of a union to bargain your wages and your benefits. And if you're part of the board structure of a company, you can have, half the vote, right? That half the say is in the workers' hands. And in the case of the capital management, I mean, you can have employee stock ownership plans where employees can actually be part of the capital as well. And you can have, you can have those structures. To me, given all of the potential structural shortfalls of cooperatives, you know, why do we prefer to mandate cooperatives versus just allowing, high working standards, unionization, worker board membership, even employee stock ownership plans? Why do we have to mandate it, right? I mean, isn't it better just to have a more voluntary but regulated system?
Well, yeah, but that goes back to what I had said in the beginning when I said that I think I see social democracy in many ways as kind of like a means testing of socialism, and when it comes to like nationalizing things. And we've
Okay,
seen that in the Nordic countries, that does increase obviously the well being of your average person. Now, what I think holds back social democracy while it's still being capitalism is, well, inequality under capitalism is would be greater under what I would assume would be under a socialist country or a socialist government. Now, inequality, it seems to be a very big factor when it comes to the happiness of the general populace. People under more equal. I'm not advocating for full like equality, by the way.
sure,
Um,
yeah,
but more people under a country with less inequality seem to be happier, and productivity seems to be up. It seems inequality actually harms the economy. Now, using that line of thought, I think that if you actively try to lower inequality, where per se, let's say under a social democracy, the top 1% owned like 15% or 25% or whatever. Um, Under a social society, if it was like 1% or own like 5%, I think we could be seeing a very different story when it comes to the overall well being and happiness of your average person. Not only just their well being, but also their productivity. And I think that is a way to maximize productivity is just general happiness of a person.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think that's pretty reasonable, but I think that kind of goes back to my uh, sort of empirical finding that the happiest countries are the Nordic economies. Now we don't have there's obviously not a lot of great not a lot of great data on socialist or when I say socialist, really I think in history that really more means centrally planned economies, and that's not a fair comparison.
Yeah.
But to go with it for a second is that there's not a lot of not great data on the happiness of centrally planned economies, and there's not great data on the happiness of like the Catalonian anarchist economy that existed for a few years, and there's not great data on the Yugoslavian economy, which some people consider like a market socialist type cooperative organization economy. So maybe it's an unfair thing to bring up the like happiness of
Yeah.
Nordic countries. Yeah.
Yeah, like sometimes it can be a little frustrating sometimes when having these conversations because when it comes to like finding historical examples of like certain concepts, they either existed like in a place with a lot of external factors that could have affected things. They live in a place where like -3 people live, or they existed in like a place for a very
Right.
short amount of time. So like it can be kind of frustrating to talk about this, considering it's
No.
not like when it comes to certain
Yeah.
topics aren't like clear cut examples.
Well, that's fair, but it does kind of go back to the point of, I just to me, I think there's not an unreasonable moral argument to have a cooperatively organized economy. That most of the businesses in an economy would be democratized essentially in their entirety. That the equity would all be owned equally by the workers, right? Um, Now that moral argument, I think I can have it. But the issue is that I'm just not sure there's a great economic argument for that type of organization. That it seems like there's an excellent empirical argument for the Nordic, Nordic style economies and things like that, European style economies, even the American and Canadian style economies have their advantages as well. Um, but there doesn't seem to be a great argument for the alternative. And again, I think something that is hard to address from I think your point of view is the idea that if it really was a better, more efficient way to organize an economy, it would probably naturally crop up, right? You saw for instance, in China, the reason that the Maoist collectivization failed was because it was terrible, and the reason that they gave rise to markets was because those markets actually emerged naturally. That the markets in and the private organization of farming in China developed as a result of basically villages just disregarding the central planner's authority and just saying, "Hey, look, we're gonna just produce what we're gonna produce, and we're gonna keep part of it." And that ended up causing a heavy increase in production, throughout the Chinese economy, and it spread throughout the Chinese world, right? And so that's a decent case of these Chinese farmers didn't, it's not like they were principled capitalists. It's just that this was a sort of natural organization of man that, when you can keep what you produce, it tends to lead you to be a little bit more productive. And so to me, the natural, sprouting of cooperatives should indicate whether or not it's actually better in terms of organizing the economy, to me at least. Unless there's some sort of provable discriminatory practice against cooperatives. I mean, I'm just not sure that, you know, as far as I'm aware, I don't think there's any discrimination against cooperatives, but maybe there is. Uh,
Yeah, I don't know if it's necessarily the fairest argument considering there are a lot of things that affect the workplace um, that are enacted by the government that didn't come like naturally. So, for example, like the minimum wage or a lot of laws that criminalize union busting or make trying to strengthen unions, things like that, or banning like child labor, things like that, were didn't evolve naturally. It was more outlawed or regulations done by the government to improve the quality of the workplace and quality of the lives of workers. When it comes to restructuring the workplace, I really don't see that much of a difference. Um, where I would say, well, it hasn't come naturally, so I'm not convinced that it would be better for your average person. So I don't know if that it is the fairest argument because you could apply that to other things in the past.
Well, that's fair. I don't think you don't always have to do the most economically advantageous thing. For instance, we could probably grow a little bit better, like just a little bit faster if we had child labor. Probably, right? We could probably have probably less, we'd probably have less unemployment, a little bit less unemployment if we didn't have a minimum wage, right? And that's probably the case, right? Um, but at the same time, I mean, these are not things that are good for the general social well-being of a society. And part of the social well-being is the economic well-being, and there's a balancing act there, obviously, because you might have the best intentions, but if you're an idiot and you're like, oh, I'm going to give everyone $1 million, obviously it might sound good, but you can see that good intentions doesn't actually result in great outcomes, I suppose. And so not that cooperatives are the same thing as like the ineptitude of giving everyone $1 million or anything. It's just that there's a reasonable balancing act. I mean, even you mentioned that even in your socialist system, there'd be some level of inequality that would be acceptable, right? And so
Yeah.
to me in my system, it's just that there's some level of inequality that's acceptable. I don't even mind encouraging a cooperative organization as a structure. I love the idea. I heard a guy mention giving capital gains tax breaks to owners that sold their businesses to the workers if they were ready to sell their business, giving preferential loan treatment to cooperatives, stuff like that. I think makes a lot of great sense. But mandating cooperative ownership as an economy, that's a seriously large amount of structural issues that I'm just not sure. Um, I'm just not sure we can get past. And to me, I'm just not sure what is what is the unique advantage to doing one over and over. If someone wants to, if in the economy that I describe, where cooperatives are encouraged and you can take a job under union protection and worker board membership, what's the problem with an employee voluntarily taking that position when they have union representation, when they've got a worker board membership, they've got the option to fund a cooperative under favorable financing terms? What's the issue with that economy versus the economy you describe, where cooperative organization is kind of a mandated form of organization from the worker's perspective?
Oh, okay. Well, I think I already had said this before that I think the best way to maximize the well-being of the worker is to um, get inequality down as much as I think feasible. Because I'm not even sure if total equality is feasible. Um, but I like
Sure.
100% total equality. But I think that making sure that the well-being of the average, I think maximizing the well-being of the average worker when it comes to lowering equality to a rather low amount um, through many different policies, including restructuring the wage structure or restructuring the workplace. I think
Hmm.
that is the best thing that you can do for the well-being of the worker when it comes to like happiness or and even when it comes to like productivity. But
Well,
I
I,
mean,
I may have, if I could
it's really
interject, I
hard to
think
talk about like theoretical stuff like
well,
this.
I may have framed my question poorly. Really, what I'm asking is, under the economy that I described, there would be a lot less inequality, and I think you would agree with that as well, right? As
Mhm.
far as like whose system would have less inequality, I don't know. I mean, it's really hard to say, obviously, but my system would certainly have a lot less inequality. Now, what I'm trying to ask is, from the worker's perspective, what is wrong with a worker voluntarily taking a job at a privately owned business, right? Like, why is that bad, right? Because from their point of view, they are maximizing their well-being. There's a well-being argument you can have for not being an owner of a business, and I can make that argument. But from your perspective, what is wrong with a worker voluntarily making that decision in my economy where they have union representation and they've got worker representation on the board?
Well, there's nothing wrong with what that specific worker would do from their point of view. I don't really see a reason for them not to take up a job like that. Um,
Sure.
so I don't think there's anything like morally wrong with them doing that or just wrong in general. I'm just saying that I think that uh, the system that I advocate for would lower inequality to as much as I think feasible. or what I think is necessary to maximize the well-being and happiness of a worker, which I
Mhm.
think in turn would help when it comes to productivity, or even just innovation. It does seem that um, innovation and invention, from my point of view, typically comes from like creativity and passion, not really profit. Uh, that's why I think in some industries, and I hope you would agree when it comes to like healthcare, uh, capitalism hinders us. Well, at least say private enterprise, when it comes to like healthcare, does hinder us in certain ways when it comes to like what is profitable or not. Um, I do think that I SOCDEMs do recognize that when it comes to like healthcare and education to some extent, but I think that you can apply that line of logic to many other things, uh, including like the workplace. When you want to like maximize innovation, I think the best way you can do that is to make sure like basic needs are taken care of, like shelter, education, healthcare, things like that. And in the long term, that probably would maximize invention and innovation. I do think it does come from like creativity and passion and not really profit. That's why like international research tends to do better than private enterprise when it comes to like things that are more than just like basic minor when it comes to like very minor innovation. But yeah, when it comes to like your actual system, no, I don't think there's anything particularly wrong with what that worker did. I just think that when it comes to maximizing the well-being of the average person, worker managed firms, uh, having as many worker managed firms as possible, which under my point of view would be almost the whole economy, would be the best way to do it.
Okay, that's fair. That's fair. Do you think that your system is best for a worker's freedom? Like, is an individual worker more free under your system? My argument would be that the answer to that would be no, because really what I'm trying to describe in a system, the economy that I describe versus the economy that you describe is that, I think the worker is more free because they don't have to have the obligation of being an owner. If you're working at a business with union representation and worker board membership, or in an economy that's predominantly those businesses, you could say, um, you're more free because you can work with the capital of that business and not assume any of the risk of that business. You have to be an owner. That's quite a stressful role for a lot of people. And a lot of people, even though they have the talent, they've got the money, they choose not to start businesses because they don't want to assume any of that risk. And that's not an unreasonable or rational choice. Many people are perfectly happy making that choice. So I think from a freedom aspect, I struggle to see how your system is advantageous. Do you disagree? And if you do, what's the argument for workers being more free under your system than under mine?
Wait, give me a second. I think my stream might have hiccup.
Yeah, no problem.
Wait, it seems to be fine. Can you repeat that? I'm sorry.
Yeah, no
That's how I
worries.
saw my
So
bitrate drop. Yeah.
no worries. So my argument is essentially that I don't think workers are more free under your system. If we're making a freedom argument, I think they're more free under my
Hmm.
system because they don't assume the risk of ownership. A lot of people choose to be workers rather than owners, even though they have the talent and the money to do so, because they don't want to assume the risk of being an owner, right? And so my question is, do you feel that workers are more free under your system? If not, why do you still prefer your system? And if you feel like workers are more free, how do you justify that belief? Why would a worker be more free under your system versus mine?
Well, I think that what defining what exactly is freedom can be can be tricky. Uh,
Fair.
but I
Yeah.
think the key I think the main question is basically what is what better um produces like a good society or I guess a better society, and what is better for like the well-being of your average person. I don't really have like a uh just I mean I typically like freedom, but I don't have like some like innate attraction to just freedom by itself. There are like some restrictions that we put on people when it comes to like whether they're free or not in certain aspects of their life, that we still put on them because we think it would produce a better society. Like we still do have some restrictions on free speech. Um, like you can't name, like you can't like yell like fire in a crowd or whatever. Technically, you'd be more free if you could do that, but it would hurt. other people, so we think that it would be worse for society. I do think so. I don't really have like some innate like love for just freedom itself, even though if I typically like freedom. But I mean, if someone like didn't want to vote in like their conventional firm, I mean, it's nothing has to say they would have to vote on everything. I mean, nothing like says that they would like they couldn't just like abstain or whatever if they didn't want to have a say, if they wanted to give up that say.
Well, not a say, ownership. Because in my system, they do have a say. In your system, they have ownership. That's the big difference.
When it comes to like, well, yeah, they do have ownership, but the main part of that is that they do control the workplace. They wouldn't really have to have like a pivotal role or any role if they didn't want to. Um, I mean, they would have the freedom to do that. I
Well,
don't really see why it would be like a mandatory. They'd have to um actively like do anything with the share that they own.
well, I mean, it's. I, I guess I'm not sure what you mean by do anything. It's not about doing anything. So like it's the risk of a business isn't you know voting on what to do or having to make decisions necessarily. Um, because anybody can make any number of decisions. The risk is the implication of those decisions, right? And the implication of those decisions is what happens to the business? What happens to your personal finances? If you're an owner of a business, you can have personal liability of a business, right? That, if you go bankrupt, the bank will take your house away, right? Or something like that, right? And if you go bankrupt in a cooperative society, you might have a much harder time getting hired or starting another business because you're going to need startup capital, and that's going to be hard to get what with your business going bankrupt, right? Now you might say that there could be a relatively robust welfare state and things like that. Those things exist under my system, but what doesn't exist under my system is the obligation of ownership of each of the individual workers. That a worker in my system can have a say in their workplace, and they can have the freedom to start a cooperative or start their own business if they want, but they don't necessarily have to deal with the risks of ownership. Even if in your society you can have a corporate cooperative where you divorce someone's personal liability from their business liability. Well, even if that existed in your system, which I'm not saying it couldn't, you'd still have the issue of basically every single individual worker being hyper criticized because of their creditworthiness, right? I mean, because at a certain point you have to discriminate to a certain extent on who you give loans to, and the discrimination comes in the form of their credit worthiness. How their history of being able to repay their debt.
Okay. Um, I don't know if I fully get what you're saying, but from what I understand,
Sure.
um, I don't think. Okay, again, I don't really have like a abstract like just like love for just freedom by itself. It's more like the implications of um obviously in some aspects, I guess if someone didn't want to like own a business, that could be a restriction of freedom. But I feel like in the end, the you would have a net, I guess, gain in freedom, whatever you can how you quantify that. Um, when it comes to like, well, there are many. I think there's probably many people that don't like the fact that they have many obligations at work when it comes to like a boss. Uh, but like I think, or like or allowing them to have a say, or everyone to have a say, and not just like a limited say over the whole business, over a place that has a substantial amount of say in their lives. I think that definitely significantly increases the amount of freedom they have over some people being restricted in some other aspect. But overall, again, I don't know how we'd necessarily quantify freedom, and I don't really have that much just love for the idea of freedom itself, and without like any implications behind it or any results. I'm
Sure.
more concerned with what produces a better society.
That's
But
fair. I think
yeah.
what I was trying to say, to put a pin on that point, it's understandable to divorce. It might be unintuitive for many for many people in general to divorce the idea of democracy and freedom. I do get what you're saying though, that these are distinct concepts. You might value one over the other, and you might not necessarily value uh, freedom at all. In terms of outcome, though, I think that the issue that I run into is that um, the idea that you would mandate cooperatives just doesn't make a ton of sense to me, unless we feel like inequality is an intrinsic bad thing, that inequality is necessarily bad no matter the circumstance of that inequality. Um, then I'm not sure why we would prefer my system, see, or why we prefer your system over mine, because at least in my system, you've got the democratic workplace to a certain extent. You've got equal say in what happens in that business. You've got collective bargaining that ensures essentially an equal playing field in terms of the workers' rights and responsibilities, and the capital ownership's rights and responsibilities. Um, but the only difference is that you do have more freedom. I would assume all else equal, you would say more freedom is better. More freedom is better. And you've got the same structures that you describe. Welfare state. Probably some sort of a single payer healthcare system. Things like that. I guess that's where I'm struggling, is that the empirical and material outcomes are advantageous in my system relative to yours, and so I'm not sure why I'm not sure why we'd advocate for mandating cooperative organization when it seems like there are capitalist economies that have shown within reason that they can balance the pool of profit with the responsibility companies should have to their employees.
Well, I already said that I do think, for various different reasons, that inequality would be lower under my system, and I do think that would yield better results, because it does seem that inequality does affect productivity and the well-being of your average person. I've also already said that I do think worker-managed firms are more resilient, even compared to uh, conventional firms with boards of workers, considering that it does seem that the resiliency of worker co-ops seems to be very significant compared to conventional firms, and that's because of a whole restructuring of the workplace that I don't think necessarily takes place when you just have workers on boards. I also said I just think that I already talked about the maximizing of just the term of just the idea of well-being. Um, I also just think that innovation. Um, that a lot of it comes from, especially in certain areas over others, comes from creativity and passion, and not really profit. And I already brought up like international research as an example of that versus comparable research and from private
Right.
industries.
Well,
I that that I
your
mean that
system.
is the overall like coalition of ideas that I think would generally justify my view.
Well, your system would have a profit motive as well, and also a need for sort of government intervention as well. I mean, the reason healthcare fails as a market um, isn't necessarily because of capitalism or a profit motive. It's because it's a market. Healthcare as a market fails, whether it's a socialist market or a capitalist market, whether it's privately owned means of production or collectively owned means of production. And so um, that's why you need a single payer or some sort of exogenous injection of competition or regulation into that market, because it just fails in and of itself as a market distribution of a resource. Now, putting that aside, I think that I guess the issue that I see is this, and I think it can we can get a bright line here with this question is, um, would you prefer a system where there are structural issues and there's arguably, you know, I would say less economic growth, but with less inequality, to a system without structural issues, like a more fluid and liquid market for goods and labor, um, and has better material outcomes, or at least pretty empirically good outcomes for their workers, but has slightly more inequality. Which world would you choose?
Can you repeat those options again?
Well, yeah, it's the dichotomy of inequality and growth, right? And how you
Oh
value
well,
one
we're
over
putting
the
that
other, right? So,
okay.
well, I mean, right. So it's like, say you had an economy where the median income was 45,000 a year, but it was collectively owned and it had like the welfare systems that I'm talking about. But then you had and they had the same price level. So 45 grand buys the same thing in both countries. And then you had another country, across the border that's the median income is $65,000 a year. Uh, but there's more inequality, right? Which society would you rather live in? Which society would you advocate for? I would advocate for the one where, it seems that the material outcome is much better, although there's more inequality. Um, which one would you advocate for?
Well, I don't think necessarily the dichotomy is inequality and growth, considering it does seem like inequality does also affect growth, um,
Well, to a
especially for
margin.
like
Well,
poorer families and stuff like that, and
well,
like
sure, but
lowering
just
social stability, stuff
it
like
does,
that.
but obviously there's a diminishing. Governments could crush the inequality in a system, but they'd also probably crush the growth of that. You can make everyone poor as fuck, and the equality would be relatively equal, right? But I'm just engage at least somewhat with that hypothetical. The idea. I think we would both agree with what I just said. The idea that you know there is some level of inequality that is acceptable, right? So, given that, would we prefer a society with a higher median income, more inequality, or a society with a lower median income and material condition with less inequality? Which one would we prefer?
Well, if one had better material conditions for your average person, then I would definitely prefer that one. So probably the one with a little more inequality if it had better outcomes for your average person. But I
That's
don't
interesting.
know if necessarily this is the dichotomy that we're arguing.
Well, not necessarily, because I assume you would agree that, like, under your socialist system, there would need to be a transition anyway, right? So we would probably
Oh
have,
yeah, of course, yeah.
yeah, we'd probably have there's probably some sort of, focal point where if my system was implemented and cooperatives had every advantage of organization and they could organize perfectly fine, and we could truly compare, worker board companies, unionization, totally private companies versus cooperatives, those four kind of options and like the combinations thereof, um, that we could probably come to a more concrete conclusion on whether or not we'd want to go into a market socialist system.